A boy who lived on the street saved a millionaire and asked him to pretend to be his father for a day as repayment. Hours later, the millionaire was in shock to see the boy with a photo of his missing wife. The sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows down the bustling downtown streets. Calvin Morse, a 12-year-old boy with tousled hair and tattered clothes, walked furtively among the hurried citizens. His blue eyes, once bright, were now dull from hunger and fatigue. He moved with the agility of one well-versed in the streets, his bare feet skillfully avoiding shards of glass and other debris. Today has to have something good. "I can't go another night hungry," Calvin muttered to himself, his stomach growling in protest. Calvin's small, calloused hands rummaged through one trash can after another, his nimble fingers quickly sorting through the refuse in the hope of finding something edible. The nauseating smell made his stomach churn, but hunger was stronger than disgust. He found a stale piece of bread and stuffed it into the torn pocket of his pants, grateful for something to chew on later. "Hey, kid, get out of there." "I don't want no dirty people around here," an irritated shopkeeper shouted, brandishing a broom. Calvin cringed instinctively, years on the streets having taught him to fear angry adults. "Sorry, sir." "I'm going," he replied, his trembling voice betraying his fear. Calvin hurried away, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he wasn't welcome there, but hunger compelled him to take risks. His eyes scanned the street, searching for another opportunity to find food. That's when he saw him, a tall, well-dressed man, animatedly talking on the phone as he strode down the sidewalk. Gerald Hawkins was the epitome of success. His impeccable suit and polished shoes contrasted sharply with Calvin's unkempt appearance. Gerald's graying hair was neatly combed, and his face bore the confidence of someone accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed. Yet there was a tension in his shoulders, a worry in his brown eyes that suggested not everything in his life was as perfect as it seemed. No, you don't understand. Those stocks need to be sold today, no matter the price. We can't risk losing anymore." Gerald spoke curtly into the phone. Calvin watched the man with a mixture of envy and fascination. What would it be like to have clean clothes and an expensive phone? To have a home to return to at night, instead of a damp cardboard box in some alley? He was so lost in his thoughts that he almost didn't notice the imminent danger. Maybe one day I could be like that too, but who am I kidding? Street kids don't have futures, Calvin thought, his eyes following Gerald. Gerald, completely distracted by his conversation, didn't see the light turning red. He stepped off the curb, directly into the path of an oncoming car that was approaching rapidly. The driver blared their horn frantically, tires screeching on the asphalt as they attempted to brake. Time seemed to slow for Calvin. He saw Gerald's face contort in shock and fear as he finally realized the peril. The car was too close, too fast. There would be no time for Gerald to move. If I help, they'll just blame me. They always blame the street kids, Calvin thought quickly, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. But something inside him rebelled against that thought. An inner voice, perhaps the last vestige of hope in a world that had long since abandoned him, screamed louder than his fear. "I can't let him die," Calvin shouted, his body moving before his brain could fully process the decision. He ran like he had never run before, his bare feet slamming painfully against the rough asphalt. The world around him disappeared. There were no more cars, no people, no deafening city noise. There was only him, the well-dressed man, and the car that was inexorably bearing down on them. With one last desperate lunge, Calvin threw himself against Gerald, using all the weight of his scrawny body to shove the man out of the way. He felt the expensive fabric of Gerald's suit beneath his dirty hands, heard the man's startled cry, and then the impact was brutal. Gerald felt searing pain explode through his body as the car struck him, launching him through the air. He heard screams, the sound of screeching brakes and the tinkle of shattering glass, but everything sounded distant, as if he was hearing it through water. "Oh my God! Somebody call an ambulance!" Calvin's voice sounded close, filled with panic and concern. Gerald tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. The pain was overwhelming, making his vision darken at the edges. He felt small, trembling hands touching his face, gently turning his head. "Sir, can you hear me? Stay awake, please. Help is coming. Don't close your eyes, sir. Stay with me. What's your name? Come on. Talk to me." Calvin pleaded, his voice trembling with fear and adrenaline. Gerald wanted to respond, to say that he was okay, but the words wouldn't come. He could feel something warm and sticky spreading beneath him. Fear gripped him. He was going to die here, saved by a street kid. Gerald. My name is Gerald, he mumbled, his voice little more than a whisper. His pain-clouded eyes struggled to maintain focus. The world around him seemed to spin, and he felt an encroaching darkness threatening the edges of his consciousness. Calvin held the man's hand, squeezing it gently, ignoring the searing pain in his own injured arm from the process of saving Gerald. Mr. Gerald, my name is Calvin. You're going to be okay. I tried to push you, but I wasn't fast enough. I'm sorry. But help is coming. Please, stay with me. The boy's voice trembled, a mixture of fear and determination in his young eyes. Gerald felt his breathing becoming more difficult, each inhalation a battle. He knew he was in bad shape, could feel life slipping away from him. With a Herculean effort, he squeezed Calvin's hand. Calvin, he gasped, thank you. You saved my life. I will never forget that. The boy shook his head vigorously, tears beginning to form in his eyes. Don't talk like that, Mr. Gerald. You're going to be fine. You have to be. Gerald felt a wave of tenderness for the brave boy. Even on the brink of unconsciousness, he couldn't help but marvel at the kindness of this street urchin who risked everything to save a stranger. Calvin, he whispered, if I don't make it, I want you to know. You are a hero. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Calvin swallowed hard, fighting back rising panic. Please don't give up, Mr. Gerald. Help is coming. I can hear the sirens. Gerald tried to focus on the boy's face, noticing the scrapes and blood staining his ragged clothes. The sight of the injured boy filled him with concern, even in his critical state. You're hurt? He managed to ask, his voice failing. Calvin shrugged, trying to appear strong, although the pain in his arm was almost unbearable. It's nothing, sir. The important thing is that you'll be okay. He forced a smile, determined to keep Gerald conscious and fighting. Gerald felt his eyelids growing heavy, darkness threatening to envelop him. With his last ounce of strength, he squeezed Calvin's hand once more. Calvin, thank you. You've given me a second chance. I won't waste it. And with those words, Gerald's eyes closed, his hand going limp in Calvin's. Mr. Gerald, Mr. Gerald, Calvin cried out, panic finally taking hold. Please wake up. Don't leave me, please. His pleas were cut off by the sound of approaching sirens, carrying with them a glimmer of hope amidst the despair. Gerald tried to focus on the boy's face, noticing the scrapes and blood staining his ragged clothes. As the man's eyes fluttered open, Calvin let out a relieved sigh. You're going to be okay, Mr. Gerald. I'm going to stay right here with you. You're not alone. Just keep those eyes open, all right? I'll be here helping you through it, Calvin promised, his voice steady despite the tremble in his hands. As they waited for the ambulance, Calvin couldn't help but think about how his life had changed in a matter of seconds. Just minutes ago, he had been scrounging for scraps, and now he was responsible for someone's life. How could I have ever thought about not helping? Every life is precious. Even if they blame me for something, I'll know I helped and did the right thing. It doesn't matter if they judge me for living on the streets. I know doing good is always the only choice, Calvin murmured to himself, gripping Gerald's hand tightly. A crowd began to form around them, some offering help, others merely gawking with morbid curiosity. Calvin ignored them, focusing all his attention on the injured man before him. Kid, are you okay? What happened? A concerned voice asked. Calvin looked up to see a middle-aged woman gazing at him with worry. I'm all right, ma'am. This man, he was hit by a car. I tried to save him, Calvin replied, his voice wavering. The woman looked at Gerald, her eyes widening in recognition. Wait, I know this man. That's Gerald Hawkins, the millionaire. Oh my God. Calvin felt a wave of shock. A millionaire. He had saved a millionaire. For a moment, thoughts of reward flitted through his mind, but he quickly pushed them away, ashamed. A man's life was at stake, and that was all that mattered now. It doesn't matter who he is. He needs help, Calvin declared, more to himself than to the woman. Finally, the ambulance arrived, its lights flashing and siren cutting through the night air. The paramedics jumped out of the vehicle, rushing towards Gerald with equipment and a stretcher. "What happened here?" one of the paramedics asked, already beginning to examine Gerald. Calvin quickly explained the situation, his voice faltering as he recalled the moment of impact. He was about to be hit. "I tried to push him out of the way, but the car still hit him." The paramedics worked swiftly, checking Gerald's vitals and preparing him for transport. Calvin watched, feeling helpless and afraid. "Is he going to be okay?" Calvin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The paramedic looked at him with a grave expression. "I can't make any promises, kid. He's in critical condition. We need to get him to the hospital immediately." Then, noticing Calvin's injuries, he added, "You need to get looked at too. Come with us." As they readied Gerald for transport, Calvin made a decision. "I'm coming with you," he stated, not as a request, but as a declaration. The paramedic hesitated for a moment, but nodded. "All right, but we can't waste any time." Calvin climbed into the ambulance, sitting beside the gurney where Gerald lay, pale and motionless. As the vehicle sped through the city streets, siren wailing, Calvin took Gerald's cold hand in his own. "You're going to be okay, Mr. Gerald. You have to be. I've never done anything important in my life before." "You can't die now," he murmured, as much to the man as to himself. The words left his mouth before he could think about them, but as soon as he said them, Calvin knew they were true. This man, this stranger he had saved, could change his life. And Calvin was determined to see it happen. The ambulance raced through the night, carrying not only an injured man, but also the promise of a new beginning. For Gerald, for Calvin, and for a future that neither of them could have imagined just hours before. As the city blurred past the ambulance windows, Calvin made a silent promise. No matter what happened, he would stand by Gerald. This man, who by chance of fate had crossed his path, would not be alone. "You're going to be all right, Mr. Gerald, and when you wake up, I'll be here, I promise," Calvin whispered, gently squeezing the man's hand. The ambulance continued its journey through the night, carrying with it not only two individuals, but the beginning of a story that would change both their lives forever. Fate had intertwined their paths in a way that neither of them could have foreseen, and now together they would face whatever the future held. Minutes later, the ambulance came to an abrupt halt at the hospital emergency entrance, its sirens finally falling silent. The doors burst open, and a team of doctors and nurses quickly surrounded the gurney where Gerald lay motionless. Calvin, still dazed from the night's events, tried to follow them, but was gently held back by a paramedic. "Easy, kid. Let the doctors do their job. We'll take care of you too," the paramedic said, noting Calvin's injuries. The boy hesitated, his eyes fixed on the door through which Gerald had disappeared. "But what if he needs me? What if he wakes up and doesn't know where he is?" Calvin asked, his voice trembling with worry. His eyes remained glued to the emergency room door, as if he could see through it. The paramedic smiled gently, placing a reassuring hand on Calvin's shoulder. "The doctors will take good care of him. Now let's take care of you. You got hurt too trying to save him, didn't you?" he asked. Calvin nodded reluctantly, finally noticing the pain in his arm and the scrapes on his body. "Okay, I'll go with you. But promise you'll let me know if you hear anything about him?" He mumbled, his eyes studying the paramedics. "I promise, kid. Now come on, there's a nurse waiting to patch you up," the paramedic replied, guiding Calvin to an exam room. Inside, a middle-aged nurse with a kind smile waited for him. "Hello, young hero. Let's take a look at those injuries, okay?" she said, making Calvin blush. As the nurse cleaned and treated his wounds, Calvin barely felt the pain. His mind was completely focused on Gerald. "Ma'am, the man I saved, he's going to be okay, right?" he asked timidly. The nurse paused for a moment, looking into Calvin's eyes. "The doctors are doing everything they can. He's lucky to have you as a guardian angel." She smiled, applying a bandage to Calvin's arm. "They're all patched up. Now how about some food? You must be starving." As if in answer, Calvin's stomach growled loudly, making him blush again. The nurse chuckled affectionately. "I'll get you something to eat. Wait here, okay?" After eating a sandwich and drinking a glass of juice, Calvin was led to the waiting room. The hours ticked by, and the boy's anxiety grew with every passing minute. He watched the clock on the wall, counting every second that went by. "Please, Mr. Gerald, be okay. You have to be okay," Calvin muttered to himself, his eyes fixed on the doors of the intensive care unit. He wrung his hands nervously, ignoring the curious glances from the other people in the waiting room. The people in the room cast furtive glances at the ragged street kid. Calvin could hear their whispers, but he ignored them. All that mattered was knowing if Gerald would be all right. A different nurse approached him, offering a cup of water and another sandwich. "You need to eat something, dear. It's going to be a long wait," she said gently. Calvin accepted the food gratefully, suddenly realizing how hungry he still was. "Thank you. Do you think he'll be okay?" Calvin asked, his voice filled with hope and fear. He took a bite of the sandwich, savoring every piece as if it were his last. The nurse smiled reassuringly, sitting down beside him. "The doctors are doing their best. We have to have faith. You're very brave, you know. It's not every day we see someone so young saving a life. Everyone at the hospital is talking about you." Calvin lowered his eyes, embarrassed by the praise. "I just did what anyone would do," he mumbled. "Not everyone would have that courage, dear," the nurse replied, giving Calvin's knee a gentle pat before standing up. "Try to rest a little. I'll come back and check on you." The hours ticked by slowly. Calvin fought against sleep, determined to stay awake until he had news of Gerald. He watched the coming and going of doctors and nurses, trying to decipher their expressions for any clue about Gerald's condition. What if he doesn't make it? What if it's my fault for not being fast enough? Calvin thought, fear gripping his chest. He stood up, starting to pace back and forth in the waiting room, unable to keep still. Suddenly, the doors to the intensive care unit opened, and a doctor emerged, his eyes scanning the waiting room. "Family of Gerald Hawkins?" he called. Calvin shot up, his heart pounding. I'm with him," Calvin stammered, approaching the doctor. The man looked at the boy in surprise but continued, "Mr. Hawkins is stable now. He sustained severe injuries, but we managed to stabilize him. He's out of danger, but he will need a recovery period," the doctor explained, his voice calm and professional. Calvin felt his legs weaken with relief. Tears began to form in his eyes. "He's going to be okay. Can I see him?" he asked anxiously, his voice shaking with emotion. The doctor hesitated, glancing at the clock. "He's resting now. It might be best to wait until tomorrow. Are you a relative of his?" Before Calvin could answer, a firm voice sounded behind him. "What's going on here?" Calvin turned to see a middle-aged woman, wearing a well-cut suit and carrying a briefcase. She looked at Calvin with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "I'm Diane Foster, a social worker. I heard whispers about a rescue involving a child and was called to handle a case of an unaccompanied minor," she said, her eyes fixed on Calvin. Her voice was professional, but not unkind. Calvin's heart sank. He knew this type of situation all too well. Social workers usually meant orphanages, foster homes, being shuffled from one place to another again. I'm not unaccompanied. I'm with Mr. Gerald," he said desperately, taking a step back. Diane looked to the doctor, who shrugged. "The boy came in with Mr. Hawkins in the ambulance. Apparently he saved Mr. Hawkins's life," the doctor explained, a tone of admiration in his voice. The social worker turned to Calvin, her gaze softening slightly. "Is that true, young man? You saved this man's life?" she asked, and Calvin nodded nervously, rubbing his bruised arm. "Yes, ma'am. He was about to get hit by a car. I pushed him out of the way, but I wasn't fast enough. The car still hit him. I did everything I could. I wish I had been quicker so none of this happened to him," the boy said. Diane studied Calvin for a moment, then sighed. "Well, that complicates matters. Normally I would have to take you to a temporary shelter, but given the circumstances..." She trailed off, seeming to weigh her options. At that moment, a nurse hurried out of the ICU. "Doctor, Mr. Hawkins is awake. He's asking for the boy." The doctor and Diane exchanged surprised looks, then turned to Calvin. "Well, it seems you have a visit to make," the doctor said, motioning for Calvin to follow him. Calvin hesitated, looking to Diane. The social worker nodded. Go ahead, we need to speak with Mr. Hawkins anyway." Heart pounding, Calvin followed the doctor into the ICU. The smell of antiseptic and the constant beeping of monitors made him nervous, but he was determined to see Gerald. They stopped in front of a curtained-off bed. The doctor gently pulled back the curtains, revealing Gerald lying in the bed, hooked up to various machines. Despite his condition, Gerald's eyes were open and alert. When he saw Calvin, a faint smile formed on his face. "Calvin," Gerald said, his voice hoarse. "You're all right, thank God, I was worried." Calvin approached the bedside, tears in his eyes. "Mr. Gerald, you're alive. I was so scared." His voice broke on the last word, and he struggled to hold back a sob. Gerald reached out a trembling hand which Calvin gently grasped. "Thanks to you, my boy. You saved my life." Calvin bowed his head, ashamed. "But you still got hurt." "I wasn't fast enough." Gerald squeezed Calvin's hand. "Don't say that. Without you, I wouldn't be here. You're a hero, Calvin." There was an intensity in his eyes that made Calvin feel valued for the first time in a long while. At that moment, Diane entered the room, followed by the doctor. "Mr. Hawkins, I'm Diane Foster, a social worker. We're dealing with the situation of young Calvin here." Gerald looked from Calvin, then back to Diane. "What situation?" "Calvin is with me." There was a protective tone in his voice that surprised even Calvin. Diane cleared her throat, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Hawkins, I understand you're grateful to the boy, but he is an unaccompanied minor. We have procedures to follow." Gerald struggled to sit up, ignoring the doctor's protests. "Listen, Miss Foster, this boy saved my life. He's not going anywhere." His voice was firm, defying anyone to argue. Calvin looked at Gerald with wide eyes, scarcely daring to believe what he was hearing. Diane looked about to argue, but Gerald cut her off. "Calvin, there's something I'd like to do for you. Something to show my gratitude for what you did," Gerald said, turning to the boy. His eyes were full of sincerity and gratitude. Calvin felt his heart race. Was Gerald going to offer money? A place to stay? He didn't want to seem greedy, but the idea of not having to return to the streets was tantalizing. Gerald continued, "I'd like to give you a reward. Anything you want. Money, a home, whatever it is. You saved my life, Calvin. It's the least I can do." Calvin felt a lump form in his throat. The offer was generous, more than he could have ever dreamed, but something inside him hesitated. It wasn't money or a house he craved most in that moment. "I don't want your money, sir," Calvin said, his voice shaking. He took a deep breath, mustering all his courage. "But my dream is to have a father, a family. Could you pretend to be my dad for a day, just so I know what it's like?" The request hung in the air, heavy with hope and fear. Calvin felt his heart pounding, afraid he had asked too much. He watched Gerald's face anxiously, waiting for a reaction. Gerald fell silent for a moment, his eyes filling with tears. Then slowly a smile spread across his face. "Calvin," he said softly, "it would be an honor to be your father, if only for a day." Calvin felt a wave of relief and happiness wash over him. He couldn't hold back the tears that began to stream down his face. "Really? You'd do that for me?" Gerald nodded, extending his arms to Calvin. The boy hesitated for a moment, then threw himself into the embrace, sobbing against Gerald's chest. Thank you," he murmured repeatedly, feeling safe for the first time in years. Diane and the doctor watched the scene, visibly moved. Diane cleared her throat, trying to maintain her composure. "Well, this certainly changes things. Mr. Hawkins, I understand that you want to help the boy, but there are legal procedures to follow. You can't keep him. That's not how it works." Gerald looked at her over Calvin's head. "I'll do whatever it takes. Calvin will stay with me, if only for a day, as he asked. After that, well, we'll see what the future holds." Diane sighed, but there was a small smile on her lips. "I'll need to do a full assessment of the situation, of course, but given the extraordinary circumstances, I think we can arrange something temporary. But I repeat, it's temporary, not permanent." Calvin could hardly believe what he was hearing. In a matter of hours, his life had changed completely. From a lonely street kid, he now had someone who cared about him, if only for a single day. "Thank you, Mr. Gerald," Calvin said softly. "I promise I'll be the best son you could ever have, even if it's just for one day." The next morning, the sunlight shone brightly over the amusement park, its vibrant lights and colors competing with the blue sky. The scent of cotton candy and popcorn hung in the air, mingling with the joyful sounds of laughter and music. Gerald Hawkins, still recovering from his injuries but discharged from the hospital, walked with a slight limp beside Calvin, who could barely contain his excitement. The boy gazed in wonder at the rides and booths, his eyes wide as if trying to take it all in at once. "Mr. Hawkins, look at all the rides. Can we go on all of them?" Calvin asked, his voice brimming with enthusiasm. He bounced from foot to foot, unable to keep still in the face of so many novelties. Gerald smiled, feeling a wave of paternal affection that surprised him with its intensity. "Of course we can, Calvin. This is your day. Let's make the most of every minute," Gerald replied, gently placing his hand on the boy's shoulder. Calvin looked up at him with a radiant smile, hardly daring to believe his luck. For a moment, Gerald saw himself reflected in the boy's eyes. Not the successful businessman he was now, but the boy who had once dreamed of days like this. "Where should we start?" Gerald asked, watching Calvin examine all the options around them. Calvin pointed to the towering roller coaster that loomed at the center of the park, its tracks snaking through the sky. "There, I want to go on that one first." Gerald hesitated for a moment, his own apprehension mingling with concern for the boy. "Are you sure, Calvin? It's a pretty intense ride to start with." Calvin nodded vigorously, his eyes shining with determination. "I'm sure, Mr. Hawkins, I'm brave, I can handle it." Unable to resist the boy's enthusiasm, Gerald agreed. "All right then, let's go tame that beast together." As they waited in line, Calvin peppered Gerald with questions about roller coasters, his excitement growing with every minute. Gerald answered patiently, surprised by how much he was enjoying simply conversing with the boy. At last it was their turn. As they climbed into the cart, Calvin grasped Gerald's hand, a flicker of fear passing through his eyes. "Mr. Hawkins," he whispered, "what if I fall out?" Gerald squeezed the boy's hand reassuringly. "Don't worry, Calvin. I'm right here with you. I won't let anything happen," he promised, his voice firm and comforting. Calvin nodded, gathering his courage. As the cart began its ascent up the first incline, Calvin gripped the safety bar so tightly his knuckles turned white. Gerald could feel the tension radiating from the boy beside him. "It's okay, Calvin. Remember, it's supposed to be fun. If you get too scared, you can close your eyes," he said softly. Calvin shook his head stubbornly. "I won't close my eyes. I want to see everything." Reaching the top of the climb, there was a moment of suspension that seemed to last an eternity. Calvin held his breath, his eyes fixed wide on the tracks ahead. Then suddenly, they plunged. Calvin's initial scream was one of pure terror, but as the cart hurtled along the tracks, whipping around tight turns and stomach-churning loops, his scream transformed into peals of joyful laughter. Gerald, who had initially been tense with worry, found himself laughing along, caught up in the boy's sheer delight. When the ride ended and they disembarked on shaky legs, Calvin was radiant. "That was amazing, Mr. Hawkins. Can we go again?" Gerald laughed, ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. "How about we try something different for now? We've got the whole day ahead of us." The carousel spun to the tune of a merry melody, the twinkling lights reflecting in Calvin's wide eyes. The boy laughed and waved each time he passed Gerald, his face a mask of pure happiness. To any onlooker, they would have seemed father and son enjoying an ordinary day at the park, but the reality was very different. Calvin was a street kid, accustomed to sleeping in dark alleys and fighting for every meal. Gerald was a millionaire who, until yesterday, had no idea the boy even existed. This would be just one day of make-believe, a day with the father he never had. "I'm flying, Mr. Hawkins, I'm flying!" Calvin shouted, raising his arms in the air, momentarily forgetting the scars of his life on the streets. Gerald laughed, waving back at the boy. In that moment, watching Calvin's carefree joy, Gerald felt something shift inside him. All the worries about business, profits, and status that usually dominated his thoughts seemed distant and unimportant. What mattered was right there, spinning on a carousel horse with a smile that could light up the entire world. As the carousel slowed down, Calvin, in his excitement, tried to dismount before the ride had completely stopped. His foot slipped, and he fell awkwardly to the ground. A cry of pain cut through the air, making Gerald's heart freeze. "Calvin!" Gerald shouted, running towards the fallen boy. Calvin was sitting on the ground, tears streaming down his dirty face, clutching his ankle. The contrast between the happy boy moments before and the injured child on the ground was shocking. Gerald knelt by Calvin's side, his heart pounding. "Calvin, are you okay? Let me see," he said, gently moving the boy's hands to examine the ankle. The skin was scraped and already beginning to swell. Calvin sobbed, more frightened than truly hurt. "It hurts, Mr. Hawkins. It hurts so much," he whimpered, his voice trembling. There was more than physical pain in his crying. It was the fear of a boy who knew that injuries could mean days unable to run from the dangers of the streets. Gerald felt a wave of protectiveness wash over him. All the joy of the day seemed swept away in an instant, replaced by an overwhelming concern. He realized that in just one day, this street boy had become more important to him than any business or bank account. "Shh, it's okay, Calvin. I'm here. Come on, we need to get you to a doctor," Gerald said, carefully lifting the boy into his arms. He noticed how light Calvin was, a painful reminder of the sparse meals that were the boy's reality. Calvin snuggled against Gerald's chest, still sobbing softly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hawkins. I ruined our day." The idea of returning Calvin to the streets, injured and vulnerable, was unbearable. "You didn't ruin anything, Calvin. Accidents happen, and I'm not leaving you, understand? I promise," he said, though he knew the social worker wouldn't allow it. As he carried Calvin out of the park, Gerald marveled at the strength of his feelings. In just one day, this boy had become so important to him. The idea of Calvin being hurt, of returning to the perilous life on the streets, scared him more than any risky business deal he'd ever made. "It's going to be okay, Calvin. I promise," Gerald murmured, holding the boy tighter against him. Calvin nodded against his chest, his tears subsiding but the fear still evident in his eyes. On the way to the hospital, Gerald reflected on how his life had changed in such a short time. From a lonely, profit-driven businessman, he now found himself deeply concerned for the well-being of a street boy he barely knew. And yet, somehow, he felt like he'd known Calvin for years. Looking at the boy's face, still streaked with tears and the grime of the streets, Gerald felt a determination growing within him. He would do everything in his power to protect Calvin, to ensure he never had to face the world alone again. "Mr. Hawkins," Calvin said softly, interrupting Gerald's thoughts, "thank you for today. It was the best day of my life, even with the hurt ankle. I know tomorrow everything goes back to normal, but I'll never forget." Gerald pushed through the emergency room doors, carrying Calvin in his arms, his heart pounding. The boy whimpered softly, his face twisted in pain as he clung to Gerald's neck. The antiseptic smell of the hospital hit his nostrils, bringing back memories of his own recent stay. The receptionist, noting the urgency in his eyes, quickly directed them to an exam room. Gerald gently laid Calvin down on the bed, his hand hesitating before pulling away from the boy. "Mr. Hawkins," Calvin whispered, his voice trembling, "you're going to stay with me, right?" "Of course, Calvin." "I'm not going anywhere," Gerald replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. A young doctor entered the room, his crisp white coat contrasting with tired eyes. He approached with a gentle smile, beginning to examine Calvin's swollen ankle. His practiced hands carefully probed the injured area, making Calvin flinch in pain. Gerald watched anxiously, feeling helpless in the face of the boy's suffering. "We'll need an X-ray to be sure, but it looks like a fracture," the doctor explained, glancing curiously between Calvin and Gerald. "Are you his father?" Gerald hesitated, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Before he could answer, a firm voice interrupted, "No, he's not." A suited woman strode into the room, her stern eyes fixed on Gerald. It was the same social worker they had encountered earlier at the hospital. Her face was tense, a mixture of concern and determination. Gerald felt a chill run down his spine, suddenly reminded of the complexity of his situation with Calvin. "Mr. Hawkins, we need to discuss your situation with Calvin," she said, her tone making it clear it wasn't a request. Calvin gripped Gerald's hand tightly, his eyes wide with fear. "Please don't let them take me. You're the only one I have," he whispered desperately. The doctor, sensing the tension in the room, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, let's do the X-ray first. Please follow me," he said, trying to ease the heavy atmosphere. Gerald nodded, carefully lifting Calvin into his arms. As they followed the doctor down the hallway, he could feel the social worker's eyes burning into his back. "Mr. Hawkins," Calvin murmured against his chest, "you promised you wouldn't leave me. Promise again, please." Gerald swallowed hard, feeling the weight of that promise. "I'm here, Calvin." "I won't leave you alone," he replied, his voice low but firm. In the X-ray room, Gerald had to wait outside, his heart clenched as he watched Calvin disappear behind the doors. The social worker took the opportunity to approach, her face a mask of professionalism. Gerald braced himself for the confrontation he knew was inevitable. "Mr. Hawkins, I understand your intentions are good, but you can't just take a minor home. There are procedures to be followed," she explained, her voice soft but firm. Gerald felt a surge of frustration and fear. "He saved my life. I promised to take care of him. I can't just abandon him now," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. Before the social worker could respond, the doors opened and Calvin was brought back, his face pale with pain. Gerald immediately went to his side, ignoring the social worker's warning look. Calvin reached out to him, seeking comfort. "How are you feeling, champ?" Gerald asked softly, taking Calvin's hand. "It hurts so much, Mr. Hawkins, I don't want you to leave," Calvin replied, fresh tears shining in his eyes. Back in the exam room, the doctor hung the X-rays on a light box. The images clearly showed a fracture in Calvin's ankle. The doctor explained the situation, recommending a procedure to realign the bone and immobilize the leg. Gerald listened intently, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "We'll need authorization from the legal guardian to proceed with treatment," the doctor said, looking hesitantly between Gerald and the social worker. "Mr. Hawkins does not have legal authority to make that decision," the social worker quickly interjected, stepping forward. Hearing this, Calvin began to panic. His breathing quickened, and he clung to Gerald even tighter. The fear in his eyes was palpable, reminding Gerald of the tough life the boy had faced on the streets. "No, please, I don't want to go with her. Mr. Hawkins, don't let them take me," Calvin pleaded, his voice broken with fear. Gerald felt his heart shatter at the terror in Calvin's eyes. He turned to the social worker, his voice firm despite the inner turmoil. "He needs treatment now. We can't wait for bureaucracy." The social worker frowned, clearly torn between her professional duty and Calvin's obvious need. She looked at the trembling boy on the gurney, then back at Gerald, whose eyes pleaded for understanding. "Mr. Hawkins, I understand your concern, but there are rules that need to be followed," the social worker responded, her voice strained. "Calvin's safety and well-being are our priority." "And you think he'll be safe and well if he's ripped away from the only adult he trusts?" Gerald countered, his frustration mounting. The doctor, seeing the situation deteriorating, tried to intervene. He looked from Calvin to the two adults, his expression a mix of concern and professional determination. "Perhaps we can reach a temporary agreement? The boy's well-being should be our immediate priority," the doctor suggested, his voice calm but firm. The social worker hesitated, her eyes moving between the trembling, fearful Calvin and the resolute Gerald. Finally, she let out a resigned sigh. "All right, we'll authorize treatment for now. But this doesn't resolve the legal situation, Mr. Hawkins. We'll have much to discuss afterwards." Gerald nodded, feeling momentary relief. He turned to Calvin, trying to calm him. "It's okay, Calvin. They're going to take care of you now. I'll be here the whole time." As the doctor prepared Calvin for the procedure, patiently explaining each step, Gerald was forced to leave the room. In the hallway, he found himself face to face with the social worker again. Her expression was serious, but there was a touch of compassion in her eyes. "Mr. Hawkins, I know you care about the boy, but you need to understand the complexity of the situation," she began, her voice softer now. "Calvin is an unaccompanied minor. We can't simply ignore the protocols." Gerald ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "And what happens to him now? He goes back to the streets, to a system that has already failed him before. Temporary homes, foster families, orphanages, where they can try to find an adoptive family for him. It's not perfect, but it's what we have for now," she explained, her voice weary but professional. Gerald felt a surge of determination wash over him. And what if I wanted to be Calvin's foster parent? Is there a process for that? The social worker looked at him in surprise, clearly not expecting that question. She studied Gerald's face for a moment, as if trying to gauge his sincerity. It's a long and complicated process, Mr. Hawkins. It requires evaluations, training, home visits. She began to explain, but was interrupted by the sound of the door opening. The doctor emerged, looking tired but satisfied. The fracture has been realigned and the leg is immobilized. Calvin is asking for you, Mr. Hawkins. Gerald felt an immense relief invade him. He turned to the social worker, his voice firm. I'm going in now, but I want you to know that I'll do whatever it takes to care for Calvin. Whatever the process, I'm willing to face it. The social worker nodded slowly, a small smile forming on her lips. I see that you are truly committed to this. We'll talk more later. Now, go see the boy. Gerald entered the room, his heart tightening at the sight of Calvin lying in bed, looking small and vulnerable with his leg in a cast. The boy's eyes lit up when he saw him, a faint smile appearing on his pale face. Mr. Hawkins, you came back. I thought you had left, Calvin said, his voice choked with emotion. Gerald approached the bed, holding Calvin's hand firmly. I promised I wouldn't leave you, remember? And I always keep my promises. Calvin visibly relaxed at Gerald's words, but there was still worry in his eyes. He looked towards the door as if expecting the social worker to come in at any moment to take him away. What's going to happen now? Is the lady in the suit going to take me away? Calvin asked, his voice trembling slightly. Gerald took a deep breath, knowing he needed to be honest with the boy. Calvin, the situation is complicated. There are rules we need to follow. But I want you to know that I'll do everything in my power to take care of you. Calvin's eyes filled with tears, and Gerald felt his heart clench. He knew the boy had already faced more hardship in his short life than many adults. I don't want to go back to the streets, Mr. Hawkins. I'm scared, Calvin confessed, his voice almost a whisper. Gerald squeezed Calvin's hand tighter, his voice firm, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Listen, Calvin. I can't promise it will be easy or quick, but I promise I'll fight for you. I'll do everything in my power to give you a safe home. Calvin looked at Gerald, a mixture of hope and fear in his eyes. For a moment, the boy seemed younger than his years, vulnerable and desperate for security. You really want that? Even though I'm just a street kid? Calvin asked, his voice laden with insecurity. You're not just a street kid, Calvin. You're brave, smart, and have a huge heart. And yes, I want that, more than anything I've ever wanted in my life. At that moment, the door opened, and the social worker entered, her face softer than before. She observed the scene in front of her. Gerald holding Calvin's hand, the boy looking at the man with a mixture of hope and adoration. She cleared her throat softly to get their attention. Mr. Hawkins, Calvin, we have a lot to discuss about the future, but for now I think we all need some rest. Calvin will be staying at the hospital overnight for observation, she announced, her voice professional but not devoid of compassion. Gerald nodded, grateful for the small reprieve. Can I stay with him? He asked, his tone making it clear it wasn't really a question. The social worker hesitated for a moment before nodding. For today, yes. But tomorrow we'll have to start dealing with the legal aspects of the situation. Calvin squeezed Gerald's hand, fear returning to his eyes. The idea of being separated from Gerald, even for a night, seemed terrifying to the boy. You'll be here when I wake up, Mr. Hawkins? Calvin asked, his voice small and unsure. Gerald smiled at the boy, feeling a wave of affection wash over him. I'll be right here, Calvin. I promise. Now get some rest, okay? As Calvin closed his eyes, exhausted from the day's events, Gerald leaned back in the chair next to the bed. He knew the challenges ahead would be enormous. There would be legal hurdles, emotional adjustments, and a lot to learn about caring for a child. But looking at Calvin, peacefully asleep, Gerald knew he would face anything for him. The social worker observed the scene for a moment before heading towards the door. Her expression was a mixture of professional concern and reluctant understanding. I'll be back in the morning, Mr. Hawkins. We have a lot to discuss, she said, her voice low so as not to disturb Calvin. Gerald nodded, his eyes never leaving Calvin's face. I'll be ready. For him, I'll do whatever it takes." The next day, the cold morning light filtered through the slats of the hospital room blinds, casting long shadows on Calvin's sleeping face. Gerald, who had spent the night in an uncomfortable chair by the boy's bedside, awoke with a start at the sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway. He straightened up, feeling his back protest after hours in the same position, and looked at Calvin still deeply asleep, his casted leg a cruel reminder of the previous day's events. Gerald barely had time to compose himself before the door swung open abruptly. The social worker strode in, her face a mask of professional determination. Behind her, 2 hospital security guards filled the doorway, their stern expressions indicating this was not a friendly visit. "Mr. Hawkins, it's time for Calvin to come with us. We've allowed you to stay here long enough. This needs to end now," the social worker began, her voice firm and leaving no room for argument. Gerald stood up immediately, ignoring the pain in his tense muscles. He positioned himself between the social worker and Calvin's bed, like a human shield. His eyes narrowed, a mixture of anger and fear rising in his chest. "You can't just show up here and take him like this," Gerald responded, his voice low but intense. "He's scared, hurt. He needs stability, not more trauma." The social worker sighed, clearly braced for resistance. "Mr. Hawkins, I understand your concern, but you have no legal authority here. Calvin needs to be under proper state care." The sound of the argument began to rouse Calvin. The boy stirred in the bed, his eyes slowly opening. When he saw the scene before him, Gerald facing off against the social worker and the imposing security guards, fear gripped his face. "Mr. Hawkins, don't let them take me, please!" Calvin cried out, his voice thick with panic. He sat up abruptly, ignoring the pain in his leg, and reached out for Gerald. Gerald felt his heart break at the desperation in Calvin's voice. He turned briefly to the boy, trying to offer a reassuring smile. "It's okay, Calvin. I'm here. I won't let anyone take you." The social worker took a step forward, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Calvin, I know you're scared, but we need you to come with us now. We'll find a safe place for you to stay." Calvin shook his head violently, tears beginning to stream down his dirty face. "No, I want to stay with Mr. Hawkins. He's the only one who cares about me." The social worker motioned for the security guards to approach. "I'm sorry, but we have no choice. We have to follow legal procedures." Gerald felt anger boiling inside him. He planted his feet firmly on the ground, his fists clenched at his sides. "You can't do this. He's not an object to be moved around at will. He's a scared child who needs care and affection." The guards advanced, their expressions determined but uncomfortable. One of them spoke, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Sir, please don't make this harder than it needs to be." Gerald didn't budge. "I won't let you take him. You'll have to go through me first." The tension in the room was palpable. Calvin sobbed softly on the bed, his body trembling with fear. The social worker seemed torn between frustration and a reluctant understanding of the emotional situation. "Mr. Hawkins, I know you care about Calvin, but there are procedures we need to follow. We can discuss options for supervised visitation, but for now, Calvin needs to come with us." She tried again, her voice a bit softer. Gerald was about to respond when one of the guards took another step toward the bed. Calvin, panicked, tried to scramble away, struggling against the sheets. In the process, something fell from inside his shirt, clattering to the hospital floor. "No, my necklace!" Calvin cried out, his voice cracking with fear and desperation. He leaned forward, trying to reach for the fallen object, but his casted leg prevented him from doing so. Gerald, acting on instinct, quickly bent down to retrieve what had fallen. His fingers closed around a small silver locket. When he stood up and opened his hand to examine the object, it felt like the world had stopped spinning. With trembling fingers, Gerald opened the locket. His heart seemed to stop for a moment when he saw the smiling face gazing back at him. It was Evelyn, his missing wife, exactly as he remembered her on the day she vanished. "Evelyn," Gerald whispered, his voice barely audible, laden with shock and emotion. The room fell into a tense, sudden silence, all eyes fixed on Gerald, who looked as though he had seen a ghost. The social worker, sensing that something significant was happening, motioned for the guards to step back. She took a hesitant step toward Gerald, her voice now cautious and curious. Mr. Hawkins, do you know the woman in the photo? Gerald nodded slowly, still staring intently at the locket in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. It's my wife. She disappeared years ago. I thought she was dead. A stunned silence fell over the room. Calvin, still clutching the covers, looked back and forth between Gerald and the locket, his eyes wide with surprise and confusion. The pretty lady, Calvin began hesitantly, his voice trembling slightly. She gave me the necklace. Said it was to protect me. Gerald whirled abruptly toward Calvin, his eyes filled with an intensity that made the boy shrink back slightly. Calvin, you saw this woman. When? Where? He demanded, his voice urgent. Calvin, sensing the importance of the moment, and perhaps a chance to avoid being taken away, began speaking rapidly. It was a few months ago, I think. She was on the street where I used to sleep. She looked sad and scared, but she was really kind to me. Gerald approached the bed, completely ignoring the social worker's protests. He gently gripped Calvin's shoulders, his eyes pleading for more information. What else do you remember, Calvin? Did she say anything? Where was she going? Calvin's brow furrowed as he clearly strained to recall every detail. She gave me food. Let me sleep in an abandoned but warm place for one night. Said she was trying to start over, that she had an important secret. Gerald felt his heart rate quicken. Every word from Calvin was like a piece of a puzzle he'd been trying to put together for years. What kind of secret, Calvin? Did she mention anything specific? Calvin bit his lip, his eyes darting rapidly as if reliving the memory. Suddenly his eyes widened with a sudden recollection. Wait, she said. She said she was going to have a baby. Gerald felt as though he'd been punched in the gut. The room began to spin around him, and he had to grip the bed to keep from falling. Evelyn was pregnant? The idea that he could have a child out there somewhere, a child he didn't even know existed, was overwhelming. My God, she was pregnant. And alone on the streets, Gerald mumbled, his voice barely audible. The social worker, who had observed the scene unfolding with growing concern, finally intervened. Mr. Hawkins, I understand this is a shock for you, but it doesn't change the fact that Calvin needs to come with us, she began, her voice a mixture of compassion and professional firmness. Gerald turned to face her, a new determination burning in his eyes. You can't take him now. Don't you understand? He's our only link to Evelyn. We need him to find her. She's been missing for months. This is not negotiable, Mr. Hawkins, the social worker responded, her voice hardening once again. She motioned to the security guards. Take the boy. The guards advanced, but Gerald firmly planted himself in their way, his arms outstretched, as if he could form a physical barrier. You're not taking him anywhere, not without a court order. Calvin, seeing the tension escalating again, clung to Gerald with all his might. Please don't let them take me. I want to help find the pretty lady. I want to help Mr. Hawkins, he pleaded, tears streaming down his face. The social worker let out an exasperated sigh, clearly struggling to maintain her composure. Mr. Hawkins, don't force me to call the police. You're interfering with an official procedure. This could have serious legal consequences. Then call the police, Gerald shot back, his voice trembling with emotion and determination. Because I'm not letting you take Calvin without a fight. He's just a child, and he doesn't want to go with you. Besides, he's the key to finding my wife. The room fell into a tense, charged silence. Gerald and the social worker stared each other down, neither willing to back down. Calvin clung to Gerald as if his life depended on it, his tiny body trembling with fear and anxiety. The guards remained poised, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but ready to act if ordered. For several long moments, no one moved. The only sound in the room was Calvin's ragged breathing and the steady beeping of the hospital machines. The tension was so thick, it seemed almost palpable. Finally, the social worker broke the silence. Her voice was strained, but there was a reluctant note of understanding in her tone. Mr. Hawkins, I understand this is an extraordinary situation, but you need to understand that I can't simply ignore legal procedures. Gerald didn't back down. His eyes were locked on the social workers, defiant and determined. And you need to understand that I'm not going to let you take away the only lead I have to finding my missing wife. The social worker appeared to be waging an internal battle. She glanced at Calvin, still clinging to Gerald, then back to the man's resolute face. After what seemed like an eternity, she let out a long sigh. "Very well, Mr. Hawkins," she said at last, her voice heavy with resignation. "I'll give you 24 hours. You have 24 hours to present your case to a lawyer and obtain a temporary court order. But if you don't by then, we'll be back with the police to take Calvin." Gerald felt a wave of relief wash over him, mixed with an understanding of the challenge that lay ahead. He nodded stiffly, knowing the battle was far from over. "Thank you. I promise I'll go through the proper legal channels." The social worker motioned for the guards to stand down. Before leaving, she turned to Gerald one last time, her gaze intense. 24 hours, Mr. Hawkins, not a minute more." When the door closed behind them, Gerald finally allowed himself to relax a little. He turned to Calvin, who was still holding on to him tightly, and gently brushed the hair back from the boy's face. "It's going to be okay, Calvin," he said softly, trying to convey a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "I'm going to do everything I can to keep you safe, and to find Evelyn together with you." Calvin looked up at him, his eyes still shining with unshed tears, but there was a glimmer of hope in his gaze. "Promise you won't let me go, Mr. Hawkins?" Gerald felt his heart constrict at the question. He knew he couldn't make promises he might not be able to keep, but in that moment, looking into Calvin's trusting eyes, he found himself nodding. "I promise I'll fight for you with everything I have, Calvin. We're in this together now." As Calvin finally relaxed a little, leaning back against the pillows, Gerald looked down at the locket in his hand. Evelyn's smiling face gazed back at him, stirring up a mix of emotions: hope, fear, determination. Gerald knew the next 24 hours would be crucial. He would have to move legal mountains, call in every contact and resource at his disposal. But looking at Calvin and Evelyn's photo, he felt a fierce determination rise within him. No matter what it took, he would keep Calvin close and unravel the mystery of his wife's disappearance. The battle was just beginning, but for the first time in years, Gerald felt he had a real chance at finding answers, and maybe, just maybe, he could get more than that. The next day, the afternoon sun streamed through the wide windows of the Hawkins mansion's living room, casting long shadows across the elegant furniture and expensive artworks. Gerald was seated in his favorite armchair, Evelyn's locket clutched tightly in his trembling hand, his gaze fixed on some distant point. The past 24 hours had been a whirlwind of emotions and revelations, and now in the quiet of his home, the reality finally hit him with full force. "Evelyn," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "What happened to you?" Calvin, seated on the nearby couch, watched Gerald with evident concern in his young eyes. "Mr. Hawkins, are you okay?" Gerald blinked, as if coming out of a trance, and looked at Calvin. The boy seemed so small and vulnerable on the huge couch, his casted legs stretched out in front of him. For a moment, Gerald wondered how his life had changed so drastically in such a short time. "I'm fine, Calvin," Gerald answered automatically, but his voice betrayed his inner turmoil. It's a lot to process." Calvin nodded, biting his lip nervously. I can tell you more about Mistress Evelyn if you want." Gerald straightened up in the armchair, his eyes focusing on Calvin with a sudden intensity. He motioned for the boy to continue, unable to trust his own voice at that moment. Calvin took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "She was like an angel, Mr. Hawkins. She found me on a cold night when I hadn't had anything to eat for days. Her eyes, they were kind, but she looked so tired, hungry, and sad." Gerald felt a lump form in his throat. How did she look, Calvin? Was she okay?" Calvin frowned, concentrating on the memory. "She looked very thin, Mr. Hawkins, and she coughed a lot. But still, she smiled at me and took me to an abandoned house where she was staying." Gerald leaned forward, absorbing every word. His mind was spinning with questions, trying to understand why Evelyn was living in those conditions, why she was on the streets. "She gave me food," Calvin continued, his voice growing more confident as he spoke. "The last piece of bread she had. She said it was important that I ate well. And then..." He hesitated, looking at Gerald uncertainly. "What is it, Calvin?" Gerald asked gently. "You can tell me. Anything you remember is important." Calvin nodded, taking another deep breath. "She cried, Mr. Hawkins, while I was eating. She looked at me and started crying. I didn't know why, but she looked so sad. She said she was sorry, that it would take time, but that one day things would be okay." Calvin's words hit Gerald like a punch in the gut. The image of Evelyn, alone, sick and hungry, caring for a street boy while carrying her own child, was almost unbearable. Gerald stood up abruptly, unable to stay still. He began pacing the room, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. "Why, Evelyn?" He muttered to himself. "Why are you going through this? What happened?" Calvin watched, feeling helpless in the face of Gerald's evident pain. "Mr. Hawkins," he called hesitantly. She seemed to be carrying a great weight, something that made her very sad. Gerald stopped mid-stride, whirling around to face Calvin. "A weight? What else did you notice, Calvin?" Calvin shifted uncomfortably on the couch, clearly struggling to express what he had seen. She always seemed to be looking over her shoulder, like she was afraid of something. And sometimes she would stare off into space, like she was lost in sad thoughts. Gerald felt his legs grow weak. He leaned against the nearest wall, feeling as though the world was spinning around him. What could have happened to Evelyn to leave her in that state? "Calvin," Gerald said, his voice trembling slightly. "Did she say anything else?" "Anything about why she was on the streets?" Calvin shook his head slowly. "No, Mr. Hawkins, she didn't talk much about herself. She would cry sometimes when she thought I wasn't looking." Gerald closed his eyes, feeling the weight of these revelations. His mind raced, trying to understand what could have happened to leave Evelyn in that situation. He had always known something was wrong. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. "Oh God, Evelyn," he murmured, sliding slowly to the floor. "What happened to you? Why are you suffering like this?" Calvin, seeing Gerald crumple, tried to rise from the couch, momentarily forgetting about his casted leg. He let out a small cry of pain, drawing Gerald's attention. Gerald looked at Calvin, seeing the concern in the boy's eyes. He felt suddenly ashamed of his weakness. Here he was, a grown man, breaking down in front of a child who had already faced more hardship than most people would in a lifetime. "I'm sorry, Calvin," Gerald said, forcing himself to stand up. "I shouldn't." But before he could finish, the sound of the doorbell echoed through the mansion, making them both jump in surprise. Gerald glanced at the grandfather clock, a feeling of dread settling in his stomach. The 24 hours were up. He knew who was at the door. "Calvin," he said, his voice suddenly urgent, "stay here. Don't move, no matter what you hear. Understood?" Calvin nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "Mr. Hawkins, it's her, isn't it?" "The social worker." Gerald didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. He walked to the doorway of the room, took a deep breath to compose himself, and then stepped out into the entrance hall. When Gerald opened the front door, the social worker was there just as he had feared. Her face was grave, her eyes hard with professional determination. "Mr. Hawkins," she said without preamble, "the time is up. I've come to collect Calvin." Gerald felt a wave of panic wash over him. "Please," he began, hating the desperation in his own voice, "I just need a little more time. There are things you don't understand." The social worker shook her head firmly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hawkins, but we've already given you more time than we should have. Calvin needs to come with me now." She took a step forward, clearly intending to enter the house. Gerald hesitated for a moment, torn between the desire to bar her entry and the knowledge that it would only make things worse. Reluctantly, he took a step to the side, allowing the social worker to enter. She walked straight into the living room, as if she knew exactly where Calvin would be. When they entered the room, Calvin looked at them with wide, fearful eyes. He shrank back into the couch, as if he could merge with it and disappear. "Calvin," the social worker said, her voice softening slightly, "it's time to go. We'll find a safe place for you to stay." Calvin shook his head violently. "No, I don't want to go. I want to stay with Mr. Hawkins." The social worker sighed, clearly prepared for resistance. "Calvin, I know this is difficult, but Mr. Hawkins can't legally care for you. We need to follow the rules." Gerald felt his heart break at the fear in Calvin's eyes. He stepped forward, placing himself between Calvin and the social worker. "Please," he pleaded, "you don't understand. Calvin is just a child and the only connection to my missing wife." The social worker hesitated for a moment, clearly not expecting this information. "Mr. Hawkins, I understand this is important to you, but Calvin's safety must be our priority." Calvin, seeing the determination in the social worker's eyes, did something unexpected. He rose from the couch, ignoring the pain in his leg, and threw himself into Gerald's arms. "Don't let her take me, Mr. Hawkins," Calvin begged, tears streaming down his face. "You need me. I can help find Mistress Evelyn." Gerald hugged Calvin protectively, feeling his own tears threatening to fall. "I know, Calvin. I know." The social worker watched the scene with a mixture of compassion and professional frustration. She stepped forward, her voice firm, but not unkind. "Calvin, Mr. Hawkins, I understand you care for each other, but there are procedures we must follow. Calvin needs to come with me now." Gerald felt Calvin tremble in his arms. He looked at the social worker, a silent plea in his eyes. But he knew, deep down, there was nothing more he could do. Not now, not legally. "Calvin," Gerald said softly, gently pulling the boy back to look into his eyes. "I promise I will find you. I will do everything I can to bring you back and find Evelyn together. But for now you need to go with her." Calvin looked at Gerald, silent tears streaming down his face. "You promise you'll find me? That you won't give up?" Gerald nodded, feeling his own heart break. "I promise, Calvin. I will never give up on you or Evelyn. I've already called a lawyer, but these things take time, but know that I will not give up on you." The social worker stepped forward, extending her hand to Calvin. "Come, Calvin. It's time." With visible reluctance, Calvin disentangled himself from Gerald's embrace. He limped towards the social worker, casting glances back with every step. When they reached the door, Calvin turned one last time. "Mr. Hawkins," he called out, his voice trembling. "Remember, she said one day it would all be okay, that she'd find her way back." Gerald nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He watched, powerless, as the social worker led Calvin away from the mansion, away from him. When the door closed, Gerald finally let his tears fall. He sank to his knees on the living room floor, Evelyn's locket still clutched tightly in his hand. "I will find you," he murmured into the silence of the mansion. "Evelyn, Calvin, I will find you all, no matter what it takes." And so, alone in his empty mansion, Gerald Hawkins made a silent vow. He would unravel the mystery of Evelyn's disappearance, uncover what had happened to her, and bring Calvin back. The battle was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Days later, the children's shelter was a drab, graceless building, with small windows that barely let the sunlight in. Calvin sat on his narrow bed, gazing out into the yard through one of those windows. Days had passed since he'd been brought here, ripped away from Gerald Hawkins' mansion. The boy felt like he'd lost not just a temporary home, but a real chance at family. His fingers instinctively touched the place where Evelyn's locket used to be, now confiscated by the shelter staff. "Mr. Hawkins, where are you? Why haven't you found me yet?" Calvin murmured to himself. A voice inside answered, "Maybe he's given up on you like everyone else." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Calvin straighten up. The door opened, revealing the social worker who had brought him to the shelter. By her side stood a couple Calvin had never seen before. The man was tall and thin, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The woman was short and stout, her eyes roving over Calvin as if appraising an object for sale. "Calvin, this is Mr. and Mistress Blackwood. They're interested in meeting you," the social worker said with a forced smile. Calvin felt a chill run down his spine. There was something about this couple that made him profoundly uncomfortable. "Hello," he said hesitantly, not moving from the bed. Mr. Blackwood stepped forward, his smile widening in a way that made Calvin want to shrink away. "So, this is the famous Calvin. We've heard so much about you, my boy," he said, his voice unnervingly soft. Calvin frowned, confused. "Heard? From who?" he asked, his voice betraying his mistrust. Mistress Blackwood let out a shrill, unpleasant laugh. Oh, word travels fast in the adoption world, dear, especially about special boys like you. The social worker seemed oblivious to Calvin's discomfort, smiling as the couple approached closer to the bed. The Blackwoods have a wonderful home out of town. They would love to take you to live with them, she explained cheerfully. Calvin felt his heart race. Out of town? That meant leaving the country, leaving any chance of reuniting with Gerald or helping to find Evelyn. I don't want to go out of town. I want to stay here, he said, his voice trembling slightly. Mr. Blackwood exchanged a quick glance with his wife before turning to Calvin, his smile now looking more like a grimace. Now, Calvin, don't be ungrateful. We're offering you a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Yes, Mistress Blackwood added, her voice strangely sweet. Think of all the experiences you'll have with us. The way she said experiences made Calvin feel as if something cold had been poured down his back. The social worker, apparently satisfied with the way the conversation was going, began moving toward the door. I'll leave you to talk a bit, she said. Calvin, behave, okay? This could be your only chance at a family. When the door closed behind her, Calvin felt as if the air had grown heavier. The Blackwoods moved closer still, their smiles now looking predatory. So, Calvin, tell us about your experience with Mr. Hawkins. It must have been interesting living with such a rich and powerful man, Mr. Blackwood said, sitting on the edge of the bed. Calvin shrank back, feeling cornered. No, it wasn't anything special. He was just trying to help me, he stammered. Mistress Blackwood laughed again, the sound making the hairs on the back of Calvin's neck stand up. Oh, I'm sure he was, dear. Men like him are always helping boys like you. Calvin felt nauseous as he realized the implications in the couple's words. He wanted to scream, to tell them that Gerald was nothing like what they were suggesting, that he was good and kind. But something stopped him, a self-preservation instinct he had developed on the streets. Well, no matter now. Tomorrow you'll be with us, and we can leave all that unpleasantness behind, Mr. Blackwood said, standing abruptly. Calvin felt his heart sink. Tomorrow, but I thought... Mistress Blackwood smiled, a smile that didn't reach her cold eyes. Oh, yes, dear. It's all arranged. Tomorrow morning we'll be on the plane, headed for your new life. With that, the couple left the room, leaving Calvin alone with his swirling thoughts. He could hardly believe what was happening. In less than 24 hours, he would be taken away to a place where Gerald would never find him. No, I can't let this happen. I have to do something, Calvin muttered to himself, feeling a determination growing within him. That night, while the other boys slept, Calvin remained awake, his mind working furiously. He needed a plan, a way to escape before it was too late. His eyes scanned the room, searching for anything that could help him. Think, Calvin, what would Mr. Hawkins do in this situation? He whispered to himself. The answer came like a flash. He would use his intelligence, observe, wait for the right moment. Silently, Calvin slid out of bed. He knew that the staff did night rounds, but he also knew that there were gaps between those rounds. Carefully, he approached the bedroom door, pressing his ear against the wood. Out in the hallway, he could hear muffled voices. Straining, Calvin was able to make out 2 staff members conversing. His heart nearly stopped when he heard his name mentioned. Poor Calvin, one voice was saying, being taken so far away after everything he's been through. That family who's going to adopt him seemed off to me, but the judge ruled the boy goes with them. There's nothing we can do. The other voice replied, I know, and once he's out of the country, that millionaire Hawkins will never be able to find him again. It's a shame, really. Calvin felt like he'd been punched in the gut. His suspicions were confirmed. Once out of the country, he would lose any chance of reuniting with Gerald or helping to find Evelyn. The determination within him grew even stronger. I can't let this happen. I have to escape. Tonight, he thought, clenching his fists. Carefully, Calvin returned to his bed, feigning sleep while his mind worked on the escape plan. He knew it wouldn't be easy. The shelter was well guarded, with security cameras and locked doors. But Calvin was no ordinary street kid. He had survived on the streets for years. learning tricks and techniques most people couldn't even imagine. "Mr. Hawkins, I hope you're still fighting for me." "Because I'm coming back to you," Calvin muttered to himself. The hours ticked by slowly, each minute seeming like an eternity to Calvin. He watched the staff routines closely, memorizing the timings of the rounds and the moments when the vigilance seemed more relaxed. Finally, around 3 in the morning, Calvin decided it was time to act. With silent movements honed from years on the streets, Calvin slid out of bed. He had fashioned a small bundle with some clothes and the little food he had managed to hide from dinner. His heart was pounding so hard, he feared someone might hear it. "Calm down, you can do this, you have to do this," he told himself. The bedroom door was locked, but Calvin was no stranger to locks. With a paperclip he had found and carefully stashed away, he worked the lock with professional skill. After a few tense moments, a soft click was heard. Calvin opened the door slowly, peeking out into the dark hallway. It was empty, just as he had expected at this hour. With cautious steps, he began moving toward the stairs. Every shadow seemed like a guard. Every creak of the wooden floor sounded like an alarm in his ears. Almost there, just a little more, Calvin thought, his heart racing. Reaching the ground floor, Calvin faced his next challenge, the main door. It was sturdier, with a more complex lock. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm him. What if he couldn't open it? What if he was caught? "No, you didn't come this far to give up now," he muttered to himself. With renewed determination, Calvin worked on the lock. The seconds seemed to drag, every noise making him freeze momentarily. He was so focused on the task that he didn't hear the footsteps approaching behind him. "What do you think you're doing?" A deep, authoritative voice sounded, making Calvin jump in fright. The boy turned slowly, his heart pounding frantically. One of the night guards at the shelter stood there, arms crossed and a severe expression on his face. Calvin felt his stomach sink, realizing his escape plan had failed. I was just... Calvin stuttered, his mind racing to find a plausible excuse. The guard shook his head, clearly not believing any explanation Calvin could offer. "Go back to your room, now." His voice left no room for argument. Calvin was escorted back to his room, the guard keeping a firm hand on his shoulder the whole time. When they arrived, Calvin noticed that another staff member was already there, rearranging the space. "He'll be under constant supervision from now on," the guard informed the other staff member. "We can't risk another escape attempt, especially with the adoption scheduled for tomorrow." Calvin huddled on his bed, feeling the weight of failure. He watched helplessly as the staff set up a chair near the door, preparing for the night's vigil. His dreams of escape and reuniting with Gerald seemed more distant than ever. "Sorry, Mr. Hawkins," Calvin thought, silent tears rolling down his face. "I tried. I really tried." With a heavy heart, Calvin finally got into the car. The door closed behind him with a dull thud that sounded like a final sentence. The interior of the vehicle smelled of new leather and an overpowering perfume, making Calvin feel slightly nauseous. Through the glass, he saw the social worker handing over the last documents to the Blackwoods. This was it. It was really happening. Mr. Blackwood started the car, the engine growling as if eager to depart. Calvin closed his eyes, silent tears rolling down his face, dampening the collar of his shirt. "Mr. Hawkins, I'm sorry. I tried to wait. I really tried," he thought, his chest tight with anguish. At that moment, when all hope seemed lost, the sound of tires screeching on the asphalt made everyone turn. A silver sports car rounded the corner at high speed, braking sharply in front of the shelter. The shrill sound of the brakes echoed down the quiet street, startling some birds into taking flight. Calvin felt his heart leap into his throat when he saw who was getting out of the car. "Mr. Hawkins," he yelled, his voice muffled inside the car, his hands pressing against the glass with such force they turned white. "Mr. Hawkins, I'm here." Gerald Hawkins emerged from the car, his impeccable suit contrasting with his expression of desperation and determination. His hair, usually well-groomed, was disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it repeatedly during a sleepless night. "Stop! Nobody is going anywhere!" Gerald shouted, running toward the Blackwoods car, his footsteps echoing on the sidewalk. The scene froze for a moment, everyone stunned by Gerald's sudden arrival. The Blackwoods exchanged nervous glances, Mr. Blackwood gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The social worker took a step forward, clearly confused, her high heels making a shrill sound on the concrete. "Mr. Hawkins, what are you doing here? We already explained that you have no legal rights over Calvin," she began, nervously adjusting her glasses. Gerald, panting but resolute, held up a crumpled envelope. "That's what you think. I have here an official document declaring that I've been appointed Calvin's legal guardian by a distant relative." The social worker took the envelope with trembling hands, her eyes widening as she examined the contents. The sound of the paper being unfolded seemed deafening in the tense silence that had fallen over the group. The Blackwoods exchanged glances, panic evident on their faces, Mistress Blackwood clutching her purse like a lifeline. Calvin, still inside the car, felt his heart pounding so hard he thought it might explode. He pressed his hands against the glass, his eyes fixed on Gerald, hardly daring to believe this was really happening. His breath fogged up the window, forcing him to frantically wipe it clear with his sleeve, so as not to miss a single detail of the unfolding scene. The social worker finished reading the document, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. This seems to be in order, but how?" She looked from Gerald to the Blackwoods, clearly conflicted about how to proceed. Gerald took a step forward, his voice laden with emotion. "How? Let me tell you how. Let me tell you why I'm here, why I fought day and night to get that document, why I would never ever give up on Calvin." And then, before everyone present, Gerald Hawkins began to speak, his words flowing like an unstoppable torrent. "Calvin is not just some boy I met by chance. He is the boy who saved my life, not only physically but in every possible sense. When we first met, I was an empty man, concerned only with money and status. I had lost my wife, the only person who truly mattered, and I drowned myself in work and bitterness. But then, on a day like any other, this brave, selfless boy risked everything to save me from an accident. He didn't know me, didn't know who I was or what I could do for him, and yet he still put his own safety at risk to help a stranger. In that moment, something shifted inside me. For the first time in a long while, I felt something beyond the pain of loss and the obsession with work. I felt gratitude, admiration, and, yes, love. Calvin showed me that there was still goodness in the world, that there were still reasons to care, to fight. And then, when all he asked for in return was one day of pretending, one day to experience what it would be like to have a father, my heart broke. Because I realized that this amazing boy, this brave hero, had never known the love of a family. He had faced the world alone, survived on the streets, and yet kept such a pure, generous heart. On that day in the park, when Calvin got hurt, I felt a fear I hadn't experienced since my wife disappeared. The idea that something could happen to him, that I could lose him, was unbearable. It was then that I understood I wasn't pretending anymore. Somewhere along the line, without me realizing it, Calvin had truly become important to me. He had become family. When they took him away, I felt like a part of me had been ripped out, but I didn't give up. I couldn't give up, because Calvin never gave up on me. He saw something in me that I had forgotten existed. He gave me a second chance to be a better person, to make a difference in someone's life. I've spent every moment since then fighting to bring him back. Not because I feel I owe him anything, but because I know deep in my heart that we belong to each other. Calvin taught me what it means to be a father. He showed me that family isn't just blood, it's choice, it's unconditional love. And that's not all. Calvin is the key to finding my missing wife, the mother of my other child I've never met. He gave us hope when we thought there was none left. He connected us in a way I never imagined possible. So yes, I fought with everything I have to be here today. I used every resource, every contact, every penny I have to ensure Calvin has a chance at a better life. Not because I'm rich or powerful, but because it's what any father would do for his son. And that's what Calvin is to me. My son in every sense that matters. I know I'm not perfect. I know I'll make mistakes. But I promise here and now in front of all of you that I will dedicate every single day of my life to being the father Calvin deserves, to giving him the love, the security, and the opportunities he should have had from the start. I'm not here just to stop them from taking Calvin away. I'm here to take him home, to give him a real home, a real family. I'm here to show him that no matter what happens, he will never be alone again. Calvin saved me that day, and he keeps saving me every day since. He reminds me of what's important in life, of what truly matters. And now it's my turn to save him, to show him that there are people who care, who will fight for him, who will love him unconditionally. So please don't take my son away. Don't separate us when we've finally found each other. Give us a chance to be the family we both deserve. Because I promise with every fiber of my being that I will do everything in my power to give Calvin the life he deserves, to be the father he needs, to stand by his side no matter what happens. Calvin isn't just the boy who saved my life. He's the boy who gave me a new reason to live, and I'm not giving up on him, not now, not ever. When Gerald finished speaking, an awed silence fell over everyone present. The only sound was the distant hum of city traffic and the occasional birdsong, as if even nature was in reverence of the words spoken. Calvin, still inside the car, felt tears streaming freely down his face, his heart overflowing with emotion. He could barely believe what he had just heard, the words of love and commitment Gerald had declared so openly. The social worker was the first to recover. With trembling hands, she signed the document Gerald had brought, the sound of the pen on paper breaking the silence. "Mr. Hawkins," she said, her voice thick, discreetly wiping away a tear from the corner of her eye, "I believe that settles the matter. Calvin is officially your legal ward." The Blackwoods, realizing they had lost, silently backed away. Mr. Blackwood turned off the car's engine, the sudden silence amplifying the tension in the air. Mistress Blackwood opened her mouth as if to protest, but a look from her husband made her reconsider. Calvin, barely believing what was happening, struggled with his seatbelt for a moment before finally managing to undo it. He flung open the car door with such force that it banged against the parked car next to it, but no one seemed to notice. The boy ran to Gerald, his feet barely touching the ground. "Mr. Hawkins!" he cried, his voice thick with relief and joy, throwing himself into the man's arms with such force it nearly knocked him over. "You came! You really came!" Gerald hugged Calvin tightly, lifting him off the ground and spinning him around once, tears in his own eyes. The familiar scent of Calvin, a mixture of cheap shelter soap and something uniquely him, filled Gerald's senses, making him realize how close he had come to losing all of this. "Of course I came, champ," Gerald replied, his voice gruff with emotion. "I promised I would never give up on you, didn't I? And a Hawkins always keeps their promises." As the two embraced, the social worker approached, a small smile on her face, her eyes still glistening with unshed tears. "Calvin," she said gently, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Are you ready to go home?" Calvin looked at Gerald, then back at the social worker, a radiant smile lighting up his face. The word home had never sounded so sweet, so full of promise. "Yes," he answered, his voice filled with joy and relief. "Yes, I'm ready to go home." Gerald placed a protective arm around Calvin's shoulders, pulling him close. "Come on, son," he said, the word son making Calvin's heart leap with joy. "We have a lot to talk about Evelyn, about our future, about everything." As they headed towards Gerald's car, the Blackwoods finally found their voices again. "This is an outrage. We had an agreement," Mistress Blackwood exclaimed, her face flushed with indignation. Gerald turned, his expression hardening for a moment. "Any agreement you had is no longer valid with the document I handed to the social worker. I sincerely hope that one day you find a family, just as I have found one in this boy. We share a special bond." Mr. Blackwood took a step forward, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "This isn't over, Hawkins. We have connections, we have—" "Enough," the social worker intervened, her voice surprisingly firm. "Calvin's well-being is our priority here, and it's clear to me that his place is with Mr. Hawkins. This discussion is over." The Blackwoods, realizing they had lost completely, silently retreated to their car. The sound of their doors slamming echoed down the street, a final punctuation to their failed attempt. Gerald opened the passenger door of his sports car for Calvin, who got in, his eyes wide with admiration for the luxurious vehicle. "Wow, Mr. Hawkins, this car is incredible," Gerald laughed, the sound full of relief and happiness. "Wait until you see the whole garage, champ. But first, how about we get some ice cream? I think we have a lot to celebrate." As Gerald walked around to get into the driver's side, the social worker approached one last time. "Mr. Hawkins, take good care of him. "Calvin is a special boy," she said, her voice serious. Gerald nodded, his gaze meeting Calvin's through the windshield. "I know he saved me as much as I saved him. I promise I'll do everything in my power to give him the life he deserves," he replied softly. And so, with the rising sun bathing the scene in a golden light of hope, Gerald got into the car and started the engine. Calvin looked out the window, waving goodbye to the shelter and his old life. As the car began to move, he felt as though he was leaving behind not just a building, but all the doubts and fears that had haunted him for so long. "Mr. Hawkins, thank you for not giving up on me," Calvin said, his voice full of emotion. Gerald smiled, reaching over to ruffle Calvin's hair affectionately. "Always, champ, always. Now let's go home. We have a family to build and your mom to find." The car accelerated down the street, carrying Calvin and Gerald toward their future together. The road ahead was still uncertain, with many challenges to be faced, but one thing was clear. They would face them together, as father and son, bound by a tie stronger than blood, the tie of love and choice. And out there somewhere, Evelyn waited to be found, to complete the circle of their newly formed family. Night fell over the city, enveloping the alleyways and side streets in deep shadows. Gerald Hawkins drove slowly, his keen eyes scanning every dark corner, every solitary figure on the sidewalks. By his side, Calvin leaned eagerly forward, his small face pressed against the car window. The boy felt his heart race, a mixture of hope and fear churning in his chest. It had been hours they'd been searching, and with every minute that passed, the anxiety grew. "It was around here, Mr. Hawkins. I saw her in this alley a few times months ago," Calvin said, pointing to a particularly shadowy alley. Gerald nodded, parking the car. "Remember, Calvin, we need to be careful. She's been lost for a long time. She might be scared or confused. And now with a baby." They got out of the car, the cold night air making Calvin shiver slightly. Gerald placed a protective arm around the boy's shoulders as they walked toward the alley. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the brick walls, mingling with the distant sounds of the city. With every step, Gerald felt the weight of the months of searching, the sleepless nights, the hopes repeatedly crushed. "Mr. Hawkins, what if she's not here? What if we never find her? It's been so long," Calvin whispered, his voice trembling. Gerald squeezed Calvin's shoulder reassuringly, battling his own doubts. "Don't give up, champ. We'll find her. I promise, no matter how long it takes." As they ventured further into the alley, the darkness seemed to swallow them up. Gerald took a flashlight from his pocket, its beam dancing across the grimy walls and overflowing trash cans. Calvin stayed close, his wide eyes sweeping every shadow, every movement. The smell of garbage and despair was oppressive, a reminder of the harsh reality of the streets where Evelyn had spent the past months. They scoured the alley from end to end, but found nothing but startled rats and accumulated filth. Disappointment weighed heavily on them, but Gerald refused to give up. "Let's try the next alley," he said, his voice determined despite the evident weariness. Hour after hour they traversed the dark streets of the city. Every alley, every shadowy corner was a new hope, followed by a new letdown. Calvin began to feel the weight of exhaustion, but he refused to suggest going home. He knew how much this meant to Gerald, how much it meant to all of them. "Mr. Hawkins," Calvin said softly as they walked toward yet another alley, "do you think we'll be able to find her? We've been looking for her for so long. I hope we find her soon. Do you think that's possible?" Gerald hesitated, the question echoing his own fears. "I don't know, Calvin, I hope so, but if not, well, we have to do everything we can to find her. She has to be somewhere." They entered another alley, this one even darker and narrower than the ones before. The flashlight beam barely penetrated the oppressive darkness. Gerald felt Calvin draw closer, clutching his jacket. Suddenly, movement caught their attention. A figure stirred in the shadows, quick and frightened like a cornered animal. Gerald felt his heart leap. "Evelyn?" he called softly, taking a hesitant step forward. The figure froze, like a deer caught in a car's headlights. Slowly, Gerald moved the flashlight beam, illuminating the figure. It was a woman, her long matted hair falling over her dirty face. In her arms, a small bundle squirmed. A baby. As the light fell on her features, Gerald felt as if the air had been ripped from his lungs. Despite the grime and the passage of time, he would recognize that face anywhere. "Evelyn, is that really you? And that's our son," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. She blinked, confused by the sudden light. Her eyes, once familiar, were now filled with fear and mistrust. Frightened, Evelyn turned abruptly, ready to flee, clutching the baby to her chest. Gerald, in a panic, took a step forward. "Wait, please!" he shouted, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't lose her now, not after searching for so long. Evelyn ran, her bare feet barely making a sound on the dirty floor of the alley. Gerald and Calvin followed her, desperate not to lose sight of the only lead they'd had in months. "Evelyn, please stop, we just want to help," Gerald shouted, his voice echoing off the walls of the alley. The chase led them through a series of interconnected alleys, a labyrinth of shadows and despair. Calvin ran alongside Gerald, his small body propelled by adrenaline and hope. Finally, they reached a dead-end alley. Evelyn was cornered, pressed against a brick wall, her eyes wide with fear like a wild animal. The baby started to cry, startled by the commotion. Gerald stopped, panting, a few meters away from her, not wanting to frighten her further. "Evelyn, why are you running? What happened to you? Please don't be afraid, it's us, your family," he said softly, trying to catch his breath. Calvin, sensing Evelyn's panic, decided to intervene. "Pretty lady, do you remember me? You gave me food once months ago and a place to sleep," he called out, his voice soft and gentle. Evelyn looked from Gerald to Calvin, her eyes moving frantically between them. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, recognition perhaps, but still mixed with confusion and fear. She pressed her back against the cold wall as if she wanted to disappear into it, the baby now quiet in her arms. I don't know you," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Please, leave me alone. I haven't done anything wrong. I need to protect my baby." Gerald felt his heart break at the sound of his wife's voice, so different from what he remembered. "Evelyn, it's me, Gerald, your husband. We've been looking for you for so long. Months and months non-stop. This is our child, isn't it?" Gerald's words seemed to hit Evelyn like an electric shock. She shook her head violently, as if trying to shake off unwanted thoughts. No, she muttered, her hands clutching the baby tighter. "I don't remember. I don't know who I am. I've been lost for so long. I don't remember you. Only the boy." Calvin, seeing Evelyn's distress, acted on instinct. He took the necklace from around his neck, the one Evelyn had given him months ago. Carefully, he approached her, holding out the necklace as an offering of peace. "Look," he said softly, "you gave this to me, remember? It was months ago, but you said it was to protect me. You took care of me when no one else did. This man here is your husband. He was looking for you and saw your photo on the locket you gave me. What he's saying is true." Evelyn looked at the necklace, her eyes fixing on the small photo inside the locket. Her hands trembled as she took it, her fingers tracing the outlines of the face in the image. For a long moment she simply stared at the photo, as if trying to decipher a complex puzzle. Suddenly she gasped, her eyes widening. Images began to flash in her mind. A wedding, a seaside home, Gerald's smiling face. Fragments of memories, like pieces of an incomplete puzzle, slowly began to fall into place. I remember something," she whispered, her voice trembling. "A ring. Vows. And this baby. I had it on the streets. Alone and afraid. But it's all so hazy, so distant." Gerald took a step forward, tears in his eyes. "Yes, Evelyn, we were happy. And you were pregnant when you disappeared. For months we've been searching for you, for our child. And now we've found you both." Gerald's words seemed to trigger more memories. Evelyn swayed slightly, overwhelmed by the flood of images and emotions. Gerald caught her by the arms, steadying her gently, careful of the baby. "It's okay, we're here now, you're safe. These have been terrible months without you, but now we can go home," he murmured, his voice full of love and concern. Evelyn looked into Gerald's eyes, searching for something even she didn't know what. Months of loneliness and confusion weighed heavily in her gaze. "I don't remember everything," she said softly, "but I feel like I can trust you. It's like a part of me knew, even after all this time. Calvin watched the scene with his heart racing, hope and fear mingling in his chest. He desperately wanted Evelyn to remember, to go home with them, to complete the family he barely dared to dream of. "Mistress Evelyn, when we met, you said that one day everything would be okay, that you'd find your way back home. I think that day has come, even after all these months," he called out softly. Calvin's words seemed to touch something deep within Evelyn. She looked at the boy, a faint, uncertain smile forming on her lips. "I said that, didn't I?" she murmured, more to herself than to the others. "I remember wanting to go back to home abandoned, but not knowing where home was. For so long I've been lost, not just on the streets, but within my own mind." Gerald gently took Evelyn's hand, his thumb caressing the back of it in a familiar gesture. "Home is with us, Evelyn. It always has been and always will be, no matter how long it's been." Evelyn looked at her joined hands, then at Calvin, at the baby in her arms, and back at Gerald. There was still confusion in her eyes, but also a flicker of hope, of recognition. She took a hesitant step towards them, as if testing the ground after months of uncertainty. "I don't remember everything," she said softly, "but I feel like I belong with you. It's like a part of me knows, even if my mind doesn't fully remember, those months on the streets. It's all so confusing." Gerald nodded, silent tears streaming down his face. "It's all right, my love. We'll help you remember. One day at a time. We have all the time in the world now." Calvin, feeling the moment was right, reached out his hand to Evelyn. "Can we go home now, all together? End these months of separation?" Evelyn looked at the boy's outstretched hand, then at Gerald and finally at the baby in her arms. Slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Let's go home. Even if I don't remember everything, I feel it's the right thing to do. For me and for my baby." As they walked back to the car, Evelyn between Gerald and Calvin, the baby now calm in her arms, the night air seemed lighter, filled with promises. Months of searching, of despair and hope, culminated in this moment. Gerald helped Evelyn into the car, Calvin hopping into the back seat, his face radiant with happiness. "Mr. Hawkins, we did it, didn't we? After all these months, we found Mistress Evelyn and the baby. We're a family now," Calvin called as Gerald started the car. Gerald looked in the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting Calvin's, then turned to Evelyn by his side, with the baby in her arms. "Yes, champ. We're a family, and we'll face whatever comes together. Those months of separation are over." The car pulled away, leaving behind the dark alley and months of loneliness and pain. Ahead, the city glowed with lights that seemed brighter than ever, a beacon guiding them home. Evelyn looked out the window, fragments of memories dancing in her mind like sparks, months of life on the streets mingling with distant recollections of a former life. "I don't remember everything, but I feel like I'm going to the right place even after being lost for so long," she said softly, looking at the sleeping baby in her arms. Minutes later, Gerald's car pulled smoothly into the Hawkins mansion's driveway. The night silence was broken by the baby's soft cries as it woke from the vehicle's stop. Evelyn, still confused and disoriented, clutched the small bundle to her chest, her eyes roaming the imposing facade of the house with a mixture of recognition and strangeness. Moonlight bathed the property, casting elongated shadows that danced across the well-tended lawn. "We're here," Gerald said softly, his voice trembling slightly with contained emotion. He turned off the engine and turned to Evelyn, his eyes searching hers in the dim light of the car. "Are you ready to go inside, Evelyn?" Evelyn nodded hesitantly, her eyes meeting Gerald's. I think so. It feels familiar, but at the same time, it's like a distant dream." Gerald stepped out of the car and walked around, opening the door for Evelyn. He extended his hand, offering support, not just physical, but emotional. Calvin hopped out from the back seat, his eyes shining with excitement, but also a hint of apprehension. The boy looked at the imposing house, then back at Evelyn and the baby, as if trying to assimilate the reality of their new situation. As they walked towards the front door, the gravel crunching underfoot, Gerald felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. It wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to make it work. The night wind whispered through the trees, as if nature itself was welcoming the reunited family. "Mr. Hawkins," Calvin whispered, tugging gently at Gerald's sleeve, "do you think Mistress Evelyn will like living here? And the baby?" Gerald smiled reassuringly at the boy. "I'm sure they will, Calvin. This is her home after all, just like it's yours too. We're a family now." As they entered the house, the lights came on automatically, revealing the luxurious and welcoming interior. The entrance hall was a study in elegance, with its marble floor and grand staircase. Evelyn stopped at the threshold, her eyes roaming the surroundings, fragments of memories struggling to surface. She touched the nearest wall with her free hand, as if the physical contact could trigger more recollections. The baby stirred in her arms, making small sounds of discomfort. The movement seemed to rouse Evelyn from her momentary trance. She looked down at the small bundle in her arms, then at Gerald, a silent question in her eyes. "Evelyn," Gerald said gently, taking a step forward, May I hold our son?" His voice was laden with emotion, the longing to hold his child for the first time clearly visible in his eyes. She hesitated for a moment, her protective instinct battling with growing trust. The seconds seemed to stretch as she considered his request. Finally, with careful, almost reverent movements, she passed the baby into Gerald's arms. The moment Gerald held his son for the first time was overwhelming. Silent tears streamed down his face as he looked at the tiny features, so much like his own. The baby opened his eyes, gazing at his father with innocent curiosity. The world around Gerald seemed to fade away, reduced to just him and his child. "Hello, little one," Gerald whispered, his voice choked with emotion. He gently traced the outline of the baby's face with a finger, marveling at the perfection of every detail. "I'm your father. I'm sorry it took me so long to find you. But I promise, from now on, I will always be here for you." Calvin watched the scene, feeling a mixture of joy and a touch of apprehension. He shifted restlessly, wanting to move closer, but not wanting to interrupt the moment. Finally, unable to contain his curiosity, he spoke. "Mr. Hawkins," he asked shyly, taking a step forward, "may I see the baby too? He's my brother now." Gerald looked at Calvin, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Of course you can, Calvin. And yes, he is your brother. Come here." Gerald bent down, allowing Calvin to see the new arrival. The boy looked at the baby in wonder, a broad smile spreading across his face. He reached out hesitantly, touching the baby's tiny hand with reverence. "Hi, little brother," Calvin whispered, his voice full of awe. "I'm Calvin. I'll take care of you and teach you lots of cool things, okay?" The baby made a small sound, as if in response, making Calvin laugh softly. Evelyn watched the scene, a warmth spreading through her chest despite the lingering confusion in her mind. Seeing Gerald and Calvin interacting with the baby awakened something deep inside her, a feeling of belonging she couldn't fully explain. In the days that followed, the Hawkins mansion became a whirlwind of activity. Doctors came and went, examining Evelyn and the baby. The sound of professional voices discussing medical terms mingled with the occasional cry of the baby and Calvin's curious questions. Therapists began working with Evelyn, helping her navigate the labyrinth of her lost memories. Each session was an emotional roller coaster, with Evelyn swinging between moments of clarity and periods of frustrating confusion. Gerald divided his time between caring for Evelyn, bonding with his newly discovered son, and ensuring Calvin felt secure and loved amidst all the changes. He spent sleepless nights feeding the baby and comforting Evelyn when she awoke disoriented. During the day, he made sure to spend quality time with Calvin, helping him with homework and simply being present. One morning, about 2 weeks after Evelyn's return, the family was gathered in the living room. The morning sun streamed through the large windows, bathing the space in a golden glow. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air, mingling with the faint scent of baby powder. Evelyn was seated on the couch, the baby sleeping peacefully in her lap. She swayed gently, her eyes lost in thought. Gerald occupied the armchair beside her, a cup of coffee in his hands, watching his family with a mixture of love and concern. Calvin was on the rug, playing idly with some new toys, but his eyes kept drifting to Evelyn, as if checking that she was still there. "I had another flashback last night," Evelyn said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Her voice was stronger now, more assured than in those first nights after her return. "I found out that I was in an accident." Gerald leaned forward, setting his coffee cup on the coffee table. His attention was wholly focused on her, his eyes filled with concern and love. "What did you remember, darling? It's okay if you don't want to talk about it." Evelyn closed her eyes, as if reliving the memory. Her hands gripped the baby slightly, as if seeking comfort. "I was driving," she began, her voice low but clear. "It was raining heavily. The drops were pounding against the windshield, making it hard to see the road. I had just left the doctor's office. I had just found out about the pregnancy and was on my way home to tell you." Her voice wavered slightly, emotion coloring her words. "I remember being so happy, so eager to share the news with you." Gerald rose swiftly, moving to sit beside Evelyn. He took her hand, squeezing it gently, offering silent support. Calvin stopped playing, his big eyes fixed on Evelyn, drinking in every word. Then suddenly there were bright lights. A truck. Evelyn continued, her voice now almost a whisper. "It came out of nowhere, skidding in the rain. I swerved and after that it's all a blur. I remember pain, confusion, and then nothing." Gerald pulled her close, careful of the baby between them. "It's all right now," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe. You both are safe." Evelyn opened her eyes, tears shining in them. She looked at Gerald, then at Calvin, and finally at the baby in her arms. "After that, it's all a blur. I remember wandering the streets, confused, scared. After the baby was born, the instinct to protect him was the only clear thing in my mind. It was like the rest of me had been lost in that accident." Calvin, sensing the gravity of the moment, rose and approached the couch. His eyes were filled with a compassion beyond his years. "Is that why you helped me, Mistress Evelyn? Like how you helped me that night?" he asked softly. Evelyn smiled gently at the boy, reaching out to stroke his hair. The gesture seemed natural, instinctive. "Yes, sweetheart. I think, even without my memories, a part of me knew I should protect children. Perhaps it was my maternal instinct manifesting." Gerald looked at his gathered family, his heart overflowing with love and gratitude. He saw the strength in Evelyn, facing her lost memories. He saw the compassion in Calvin, a boy who had faced so much, yet still capable of so much love. And he saw the miracle of his child, a new life that had almost been lost, but now was safe in his arms. He cleared his throat, feeling it was the right moment to share the news he had been keeping. "Calvin, Evelyn, there's something I'd like to say. Something I've been thinking about since we found each other in that alley," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. All eyes turned to Gerald, anticipation hanging in the air. Calvin straightened up, his eyes wide with anticipation. Evelyn tilted her head, curiosity mixed with a touch of apprehension in her gaze. I've started the final adoption process for Calvin," Gerald announced, his words laden with meaning and emotion. He looked directly at the boy, wanting him to understand the depth of his commitment. "Calvin, I want you to officially be part of this family, not just as someone we're caring for, but as our son." Calvin's eyes widened, a mixture of shock and hope crossing his face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out initially. When he finally found his voice, it was trembling with emotion. You'll have custody of me? You'll be my parents? For real? Not just because I helped find Mistress Evelyn?" Gerald smiled, reaching out to pull Calvin close. He placed his hands on the boy's shoulders, looking him in the eye. "No, champ, it's not just because of that, it's because of who you are. Brave, kind, smart. You're already part of this family and what matters. Now we want to make that official. If you want, of course." Tears began streaming down Calvin's face. He threw himself into Gerald's arms, sobbing with joy. His little arms clung to Gerald as if afraid that if he let go, all of this might disappear. "Yes!" he exclaimed between sobs. "Yes, I want to. I want to so much." Evelyn watched the scene, feeling the last pieces of the puzzle of her life falling into place. It was as if a fog was lifting from her mind, revealing the clarity behind. Memories of her love for Gerald, of their life together, of their dreams for the future. It all began flowing back, like a river after the spring thaw. Gerald, I remember. Not everything, but I remember us, our love, our plans. How we dreamed of building a family together, she said softly, her voice clearer and more confident than it had been in weeks. There was a new light in her eyes, a sparkle of recognition and love. Gerald looked at her, his eyes shining with hope and love. Evelyn, you remember us? She nodded, a genuine smile lighting up her face for the first time since her return. Yes, and I want this, all of us, together, a family. You, me, our Calvin and the baby. She reached out, caressing Calvin's face tenderly. If you'll have us, dear, we'll be your parents. All of us, one complete family. So, against all odds, the Hawkins family finally came together. What began with an act of bravery from a street kid, followed by months of relentless searching, culminated in a new beginning full of promise. Gerald, Evelyn, Calvin and the baby would face challenges ahead, no doubt, but now they had each other to lean on. The love that bound them, a love that overcame amnesia, separation and despair, would be their driving force. As the sun set over the Hawkins estate, bathing the room where the family was gathered, it was clear this was not an ending, but the start of a new and beautiful journey together. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that is about to appear on your screen. We are immensely grateful to have you here with us. Now you can click on the links appearing on the screen right now. We have a special selection just for you, filled with valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.